Hello, everyone, and welcome. This is Jessica McKay from jessicamckay.net, and you're listening to my show on Human Spirit Radio Network. I'm an intuitive guide and spiritual teacher, and my show has largely been about developing and recognizing your intuition, but it's also been a place where I've invited other teachers and guests who have important messages to share, people who have a deeper understanding of life's mysteries. And today, I'm incredibly excited, honored, and blessed to have John Anthony West on the line, scholar, explorer, guide, expert on ancient Egyptian culture. John is the author of Serpent in the Sky, The High Wisdom of Ancient Egypt. He's the author of A Case for Astrology and The Traveler's Key to Ancient Egypt. John was featured in the NBC documentary, The Mystery of the Sphinx, which introduced viewers to the discovery that the Sphinx is weathered by rainwater, clear evidence that the Sphinx is actually thousands of years older than the currently accepted date of 2500 BC. John was also in the very popular 8-part Magical Egypt series based on his research, and you can get that whole set by going to his website at jawest.com. John Anthony West takes groups to Egypt and reveals the real Egypt, the symbolist interpretation of Egypt, and we'll be talking about what that means, that you would definitely not encounter with a regular tour guide. And I just want to share a quick story about how I came into contact with John's work. I was in my early 20s and searching for the meaning of life, pretty much. And I wanted to know what's going on here, who am I, why am I here, etc. And one day I happened to see a lecture by John Anthony West called Symbolist Egypt, The Meaning Behind the Magic. And in that lecture, which is also on YouTube, by the way, John said that if we understand ourselves, we understand the universe. And I thought this was really profound, and it rang true for me that the individual could be a microcosm of the whole. In his work, John demonstrates how the ancient Egyptians expressed that wisdom in their art and architecture through sacred geometry, which has a real emotional impact on anyone who comes into contact with it. So after I watched the lecture, I started reading John's books, which are so deep, so intelligent, and give incredible insight into the wisdom that humanity once had but clearly has lost. John writes in his book, Serpent in the Sky, "Today, to believe in progress, a man must be insane," meaning that despite the technological advances we've seen in our lifetimes, we've lost important wisdom that the ancient Egyptian culture had. So this is going to be a really fascinating show. Thank you all for listening. And John, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today.
Why, thank you, Jessica. That's good, too. After quite a while of not being in touch, it's great to see you doing this and spreading the word, as it were. One other thing, actually, the Magical Egypt series is not on my website, actually. You can buy it on my website, but I don't have the notice up yet, and I keep forgetting to tell you
okay.
to put it on there. So, all they have to do is email me, and I will direct them to how to get.
Perfect. So, would you please tell us a little bit about the work you do? What exactly is the symbolist interpretation of Egypt?
What it is that this is the work of a great genius of a scholar, R.A. Lubitsch, the genius with the unpronounceable name. I sometimes think if his name were Smith, everybody would know about him, but Lubitsch is a mouthful. And all of these are long stories, but anyway, he died in he died in 62 or 63, I think, age 72 or 73. And he was a boy genius. His first book was about number symbolism. It was just a pamphlet, really, but it was written when he was 16 years old. And he was a rarity in these days, a practicing alchemist. And anyway, to cut a very long story short, in the middle 30s, he had been teaching for a long time, and he was exploring the idea that prevalence from ancient Greece, that it was Egypt that was the source of all what are called the Hermetic sciences, astrology, magic, number symbolism, Neoplatonism, all of these disciplines believe the people, the adherents or the practitioners of those disciplines, were convinced that their wisdom came originally out of Egypt, including the ancient Greeks. Nowadays, that's another big long story. What we call history was mostly developed in the 19th century, and actually what it is it's a Eurocentric white supremacist con job that credits Greece with the beginnings of what we call civilization, and before that it was simply architecturally advanced superstition. And Schwaller wanted to demonstrate there was no proof of the notion that, when Kepler discovered the laws of planetary motion, he exulted that he had rediscovered the astronomy of the ancient Egyptians, but he really couldn't prove that bit of it. And so Schwaller went to Egypt with his wife, who he was very lucky in that he had a very wealthy wife who could finance his researches without him having to take a day job. And what Schwaller was looking for was specifically the golden section, the phi, the magic number that is behind so much of art and architecture stemming from Egypt on down. And the golden section was supposedly a discovery of Pythagoras, the Greek mathematician, 6th century BC. Doesn't matter that the biographies of Pythagoras say that he studied 22 years in Egypt, studying with the Egyptian priests. Still, Greece gets credit for the beginnings of civilization, though the Greeks themselves acknowledged the debt that they owed to Egypt. Each of these statements, by the way, we don't have that much time. We have an hour on my trips. Of course, we have 10 hours a day talking about these things. We can go on at great length. Anyway, Schwaller quickly found that the Egyptians did know of the golden section, which meant that they would automatically know about sacred geometry, about the laws of harmony, and all of these other things. And he found that in the famous temple of Luxor, which was built mostly around the 14th century BC. So, having found it, it was clear that the Egyptians were at least 1,000 years ahead of Pythagoras, and actually by extension, once you get into it, you see that this knowledge was there from the very beginning. Whenever the pyramids were built, they knew about phi and pi, the relationship of the diameter of a circle to its circumference. They had all of this knowledge, and they had it from the very beginning, and the very beginning that Egypt is credited with, in other words, around 3,200, 3,500 BC. Supposedly, Egypt arises out of virtually nothing, out of simple Neolithic culture, really through my own work, and which is actually generated by an observation of Schwaller de Lubitsch, and which has in turn, through me and through a number of my colleagues, set up a kind of a cottage industry devoted to rewriting the garbage history that we're taught in school and that is prevalent still to this day among archaeologists and anthropologists and Egyptologists and all those disciplines that are devoted to the past.
Observation that you made is that the Sphinx is weathered by rainwater, and that's what Schwaller de Lubitsch had said. Is that the
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I realized actually that was in an ancillary book of Schwaller's that he wrote toward the end of his life. Now translated, it wasn't translated when I was reading it. I had to learn French in order to read Schwaller. Actually,
wow.
That is my Egyptian greyhound barking there.
Oh.
We're not not on Skype, so you can't see him, but he's a spectacular dog. Anyway, that was Schwaller's observation, and I realized when I read that it was at the end of a long chapter where he's arguing that Egypt is much older than the Egyptologists will allow, but this was almost a throwaway line, and I realized he didn't develop it at all, and I realized that was the key. If you could prove the other rest of the argument was scholarly, but this is science, geology. This was geology. If you could prove the Sphinx was weathered by water, in and of itself, it would mean that it was many, many thousands of years older than it has been, than its attribution, and that in turn would be actually a real game changer. I mean, this was a single line in Schwaller, but on it rests no less than the entire account of what we Westerners, or in fact, well, no, the East is different, but what we in the West think is the historical timeline going back from supposedly primitive beings to our advanced selves with our hydrogen bombs and our bobblehead dolls and our striped toothpaste. Because the Sphinx, apart from being arguably the most spectacular sculpture on the face of the planet, is adjacent to temples that, relatively speaking, are by Egyptian standards small, but that are constructed of gigantic blocks, 7,500 ton, 150 ton blocks that are slotted into place like pieces of a giant stone jigsaw puzzle. And the fact of the matter is that with all of our marvelous technology, we can fly to the moon and put a man on the moon, but we couldn't, with the present technology available to us, build those temples. If we put our minds to it, we probably could figure out a way to do it. But as I'm talking now, we couldn't do it. So it means that not only was the most spectacular sculpture on Earth, from an artistic point of view, carved at a time when there's not supposed to be any civilization, but it is adjacent to temples that we couldn't do today. So what I call, I mean, the religions that are in place now are mostly depraved and at the very least corrupt. You see all of this terrible stuff that's going on by people in the name of God, be it Allah or Buddha or Yahweh or whoever. All of this terrible stuff is going on. But
yes,
intellectually, philosophically, the most powerful church is what I call the Church of Progress, which is based upon the dogmatic belief that despite all of the evidence to the contrary, we're the most advanced beings that have ever walked the face of this planet. And so in Schwaller's single one-line observation of the water weathering to the Sphinx rests the foundation of our terrifying Church of Progress. So, and I realized that, and evidently Schwaller didn't, or anyway, he didn't pursue it any further, and he died about a year after that book was published. So when I didn't miss Schwaller by that much. I was introduced to him, to his work, when I was had moved from Spain to England back in the middle '60s, and then found my way first initially through the Gurdjieff work, and then my first nonfiction book. Because before that, actually, I'm going to backtrack a little bit. I was never a boy genius in any sense of the word, but I was actually, looking back, I was psychologically precocious. I understood at the age of 13 that I'd been born into a lunatic asylum, and that what people called progress was, in a sense, a form of madness. It took me a long time to be able to articulate that. But by the time I was 19, I knew what I wanted to do. I wanted to be the little boy who said the emperor has no clothes, and prove to all the lunatics out there that it was lunatics and not progress. So I started out, I had no sense, no inclination whatsoever, none, to do scholarship. I wanted to write, and did, write satire, mostly satire. I published a novel and a book of short stories, and things, a number of plays went out, Nothing that ever made any money, unfortunately, but I'm quite happy with and would love to see. In fact, I'm in the process of self-republishing some of the books and looking for ways to revive those plays and film scripts and so on. Even at my age, I feel I'm really just beginning. Back to Schwaller. So I realized that single line was the key to reconfiguring and rewriting in its entirety the past. And Schwaller didn't pursue the water weathering hypothesis, but he did pursue, in grand magisterial fashion, his discovery that Egypt knew about the golden section and the Fibonacci numbers and so on. And with that firmly established, he proceeded to reinterpret the entirety of the Egyptian civilization, and that reinterpretation is Symbolist Egypt. It's the Egypt of the ancient Egyptians, as opposed to the Egypt of the Egyptologists, which is effectively the opposite of what the Egyptians themselves believed. Mm-hmm. So, in other words, I come back to your question circuitously. That's what Symbolist Egypt is.
Well, and I found it so fascinating in your book, Serpent in the Sky, where you talk about Schwaller de Lubitsch, but you talk about Pythagoras and the relationship of numbers and how the Egyptians would create a temple using you compared it. You expressed it so much more articulately than I am right now, but you compared it to music and how everything vibrates and notes vibrate, and the temples they created to vibrate in a certain way by using mathematics, and music uses mathematics, so that when people go into those temples, they have a sensation, they feel something, they're given knowledge in a way that you don't need language to do. So I just think that that's amazing. And I'm wondering, on your journeys with people, and you take them into these temples, what is the effect? How does it feel to walk into some of these places, like the Temple of Man, or the Luxor, Temple of Luxor?
That's absolutely correct, Jessica. It was Goethe who said, the German poet, who said that, who called architecture frozen music. And that's not just poetically true, it is quite literally true. In other words, let's go back a little bit. The temples are consecrated to the so-called gods. As soon as you say the gods, everyone thinks that you're talking superstition. But actually, when the gods are understood as cosmic principles, and those principles, let's say, the principles that govern our organic life, are fertilization, gestation, growth, maturity, old age or senescence, death, and renewal. Those are principles. And each of those principles was associated with, for good reason, and it's complicated, and we don't have time for it here, but we're associated with good reason with certain numbers and sets of numbers. Those numbers, in turn, give rise to specific geometries. And when those geometries are expressed in architectural form, it is exactly, literally, frozen music. And when we walk into those places, even today, even when they're fairly ruinous, if we go in the right way with a degree, ideally, with a degree of reverence, and we do it when Egypt is not crowded, which at the moment, thanks to our media prostitutes, it isn't, because everybody's scared stiff to go. And in fact, nobody's after us. So this is the time to get to Egypt before it builds back up again. And look for my trips. Go to my website. You'll find the next one listed. I don't have anything listed for the autumn yet, but almost certainly there will be something. There may be a big media follow-up for our Mystery of the Sphinx going on, in which case I'll be filming and not taking people around. But anyway, in theory, there will be, and there is still time to get on the one that's about a month from now in February. But when you go in there, unless you are emotionally defective, spiritually dyslexic, and philosophically depraved, the music will work on you, and people go in there and come out literally changed. I mean, there are very few people on my trip who don't come back in some sense or another, some very important inner sense, different than when they went there. Actually, best line, I quote it all the time, by one of the most perceptive of early visitors to Egypt was Florence Nightingale, who comes down in history as this one-dimensional lady with the lamp. Actually, was an amazing woman, absolutely brilliant. And she was traveling in Egypt in 1850, and she wrote home to her parents and friends. She said, "One wonders that people come back from Egypt and live lives the way they lived them before." And this is literally true. When you, I usually start off lectures these days with a good line that gets everyone's attention. I say, Egypt is like sex. Everybody gets attention. That automatically everyone brings to attention. But why is it? Well, you can read all about it, and that intellectually teaches you something. You can look at pictures, and that tells you a bit more. But you don't actually, and you can't understand it until you've experienced it. And Egypt is like that. No matter how much you read, no matter how much you look at wonderful photographs and great, wonderful paintings, all sorts of things, until you've been there, you can't imagine the power of this incredible art and architecture. And at the end of a couple of weeks, the end of a trip, you know viscerally in your gut the difference between what civilization once was and what we laughably call, we call it progress, but it isn't actually, other than technologically. It is regress. I call it shiny barbarism. So that's why Egypt is so important. If it were just a matter of the dating of it, well, that would be an interesting scholarly argument. But it's much more than that. And it's too bad that the Egyptologists battle the symbolist view to this day. It's Schwaller is a pariah for the most part to the Egyptological community. And my own conviction is that unless a substantial number of people not only understand and study, but actually practice the one issue that fueled Egypt for 3,000 years, which is the quest for immortality. Unless people understand that that's not, enough people understand that that's not superstition and it's not fantasy, it's not it's not crystal gazing or tree hugging. It is a specific practical doctrine that enough people have to do and develop their own consciousness to a level where they become, or we become, I won't say we, they, everyone, whoever bites the bullet and actually puts the knowledge to work, there's no possibility really of what I would call a civilization. There's just worse, more there's just more barbarism, but it keeps getting shinier. All of this stuff about artificial intelligence, all of this is barbarism. It's completely useless, and worse, it's actually destructive because it takes us still further, ever further, away from our own creative capacities and our own recognition of and ability to access those higher levels of understanding and consciousness.
Absolutely. And in fact, I think I read an article recently about the smartphones, that we look at them constantly, and so we no longer have moments where we daydream, like if we're on a train or we're traveling, and because we don't do that anymore, we're less creative than we used to be. We don't come up with ideas.
Yeah, technology. One of Robert Schock, my geological colleague. More long story that we don't have time for here. But we hope to be we're working on a book telling the whole story of reinterpreting the Sphinx and proving that it's much, much older, and so on. And the part of that book will be, and it's now getting into my lectures and things like that too, that most people who've read the Bible at all know the revelation of John, the four horsemen of the apocalypse, who are war, pestilence, famine, and death. It's actually a rather peculiar four horsemen, because when you stop to think about it, because death comes to us all, war, famine, and pestilence are mostly outside of human control. The only one in theory we have any control over is war. So it's an odd choice of horsemen. But I've been working on something. I don't know if it'll be part of a book, or I certainly do talk about it in lectures, or I'm increasingly talking about it in lectures. I have the five cowboys of Apocalypse 2.0, which are capitalism, patriotism, democracy, technology, and entertainment. And we don't have time to go into them. We don't have time to go into them here. But we think of those in our Church of Progress as the good guys. And as a matter of fact, they are absolutely destructive. Problem with technology. I mean, there's some very nice, lots of good technology out there. I mean, there is an upside to technology, very little upside to capitalism, patriotism, or democracy, actually. But technology, there is an upside. The downside is, and it's a big downside, that it prevents the great majority of human beings from making a living out of their own creativity. The guys who design the designers of the technology, they get an opportunity to be creative, but often it's for perverse things. I mean, to come home and say, well, you've invented a better gas oven or a superior lethal injection, or a stripier toothpaste. This is not really. This is not Beethoven's late quartets or the Cathedral of Shasta. So, but most of us are trapped. I mean, I suspect that whoever's listening to this show, the vast majority, 95% of the people, I'm just inventing a percent, but 95% of the people who are listening are waking up in the morning and they're not spending their day being creative. And they might be doing something that's intellectually demanding. Intellectually demanding is not the same as creative. When you're being creative, you know it. And very few people are capable of making or are in a position to make a living out of being creative. I mean, my own definition of happiness is when you wake up in the morning and what you have to do is what you would choose to do. If that's the case, you're ahead of the game. But that doesn't apply very often. I mean, look at how when you watch one of the financial stuff on network rubbish radio or network television. Half the ads are directed toward somehow or another retiring as early as possible and doing nothing for the rest of your life. That's death. You might as well commit suicide. I mean, if you're an athlete, you have to retire, by the time you're 40 for the most part. But if your aim in life is to get out of doing what you are doing, you're doing something that's fundamentally unsatisfying and uncreative. And so anyway,
yes, I spent many years trying to get out of what I was doing, working in offices. And it was the most uncreative thing ever. But what I would love to ask you is, I would love to hear your opinion just about why we have fallen so far, why we've regressed so far. If the human race used to have this, the ancient Egyptians had this knowledge about immortality and spirituality and the nature of being human. If they had this knowledge, why is it that with our striped toothpaste and all of our things, why are we so dense? What is that about?
Well, dense is the right word, actually. We're solidified, ossified. Probably, I mean, now we're out of the realm of science in any way, shape, or form, or even out of the realm of scholarship. But the Hindus, and it's Vedic knowledge where they talk about the yugas. Plato had that, I knew about that too, where he talked about the eons or the ages. There's a golden age and a silver age and a bronze age and an iron age, which is the dark age, as it were. And this is a big subject. And the Hindus have codified it. I mean, they have the ages of different lengths, and it's a really fascinating study. Actually, it's a very, very good book by a friend of mine, and you should try and get hold of him and see if you can get him on the show, named Jocelyn Godwin, Godwin. Recent book called Atlantis and the Cycles of Time, because the cycles of time, those are the yugas, and when you ask your question, which is an absolutely valid question, it's almost the only way to account for why, when there is this unbelievable, sophisticated knowledge available to whole civilizations and ostensibly the whole Earth, actually. Egypt is not necessarily the most advanced of those or the most sophisticated of those civilizations, but it's one that there's the most left of it. So you can actually visit it in Egypt and effectively see it in action, whereas you can't do that with China or Japan, or to a certain extent you can with South America, Mesoamerica, Mexico. But in Egypt you actually see it operational still, even though the temples are half in ruins and we don't understand the symbolism on the walls, the art, and the architecture works, but the art we perceive as being fabulously beautiful, but not really meaningful intellectually. It can be if you've studied it long enough, but it doesn't really hit you the way that the architecture does. Why it should degenerate, but if it's only the yugas that, I mean, why should it degenerate? But it's analogous to the seasons. What you can do easily in June is very, very difficult to do in December, at least where we live. And it's something of that nature. It's in the nature of the cycles of time that this ebb and flow of civilization operates. And there are some wonderful quotes of this Hermetic doctrine of Egypt. I think it's in my guidebook, which now has just gone out of print because I have to do an upgrade of it. But it's natural to us. I mean, it's natural that this has to happen, but on an individual level, we're not obliged. I mean, you can grow roses in January if you know how to do it, but you need very special equipment, and you have to live a very special lifestyle in order to do this. I'm kind of, I mean, it seems to me that, in fact, around the time within a few hundred years or so of the time of Jesus, Buddha springs up a little bit before that, Lao Tzu in China, Muhammad's a few hundred years after that. But all of these, basically all of those religions of, you might say, the Piscean age, it comes into the processional ages shifts from Aries. It starts about 2000 BC, and then Pisces about 0 BC. In other words, time of Jesus. The knowledge. I mean, these are dark ages, and darkest in Europe perhaps, but pretty dark in other places as well. And the knowledge was, for the most part, the knowledge was was kept in monasteries or in cloistered places that where people, religious people, extracted themselves from the chaos and the warfare, and retained the knowledge, such as it was, and it was sort of like like hothouses where the seed could be kept protected until it was ready to be fertilized and replanted and burgeon into a new and and sophisticated society. And I think that's sort of where we stand now. The seeds are in fact there through people like Schwaller and Gurdjieff, and there are certain of the old systems. Mostly they're depraved and corrupt, but there are a few practicing Christians and there are a few practicing Muslims. They don't get much press, but they're there. And practicing Hindus, probably the Far East has a bit more of its origins, but it's the Church of Progress pretty much has invaded and destroyed all of it. But they're there, and we're now at this breaking point now. Either enough of us understand what civilization really entails and work on it individually. It's not an intellectual pursuit. It's something that has to be done on a day-to-day basis, on a minute-by-minute basis, actually. And if enough of us are doing it, there's a possibility that we'll somehow or another survive the onslaught that we're living in the middle of. I mean, in the last couple of years, it's all of this sectarian and religious strife has come up, or the environmental stuff and the military stuff and the medical stuff and the big pharma and and GMOs. All of this stuff is quite literally diabolical, but most of it is called progress. And the people who found it think that, oh, well, the other guys are responsible for the mess, but if people would just do what we say and plant our genetically modified corn, et cetera, civilization would reestablish itself. And it's usually the promoters, it's the deluded idiots who think that technology is going to get us out of the same mess that, for the most part, it got us into. And this is a big this is a big subject, in fact.
Yeah.
That technology has the answers, but I mean, I think it has none of the answers. What it does have, though, however, is the capacity to broadcast the kind of things that we're talking about. I mean, nobody's inviting you or me at the moment, anyway, to CNN or NBC or Hollywood. Oh, we did. I mean, the mystery of the Sphinx was 20 years ago, but it got to hundreds of millions of people, actually.
Yeah, so it was very powerful.
It has that capacity, and see, even though it's used for the most part for frivolous or nefarious purposes, the internet allows anybody to reach effectively the entire planet, at least in principle, at the click of a button. So this is when I was talking before about technology, it deprives the majority of the ability to make a living out of their own creativity. On the other hand, intellectually, it provides an avenue for broadcasting of ideas that run counter to the prevailing non-wisdom. And this Victor Hugo, the French writer of the 19th century, said, very famous line, "There's one thing more powerful than all the armies in the world, and that is an idea whose time has come." This is a very good saying. What Hugo didn't say was that the second strongest thing in the world is an idea whose time has not yet gone. And since all of the armies in the world, not just military, but economic and educational and medical and agricultural and ecological are wholly committed to the idea, which is progress, the idea that has not yet gone. This is a battle, and I've been aware of me personally that it's of the battle, from early childhood. I knew, without being able to articulate it, that's the upcoming battle, and the only one that actually has any meaning. It doesn't matter if phony Democrats get in or even phony or Republicans get in. All of them are committed to the Church of Progress one way or another. So the wonderful Argentinian writer used to say at the end of one of his books, Jorge Luis Borges, great line, "A gentleman only fights for lost causes." I don't necessarily consider myself a gentleman, but I don't mind fighting for this particular lost cause.
Well, yeah, it's very valid, and the implications are so important to know that history is wrong, that the Church of Progress is not the way to go. It's so important, and I'm grateful, as I've been following your career for years, that you've kept at it. And I really want to encourage people to read your books. Serpent in the Sky was just excellent. If they want an understanding of Symbolist Egypt, it gives a great understanding. And it's just so insightful. And also to order The Mystery of the Sphinx, which was very, very powerful documentary, which they can get on your website as well, I believe.
Yeah, actually, they can get it on my website. They can order it direct from me, but you can get it on Netflix too now.
Oh, excellent.
You can go to
excellent.
Netflix and get it. So it's there, yes. And then once, if the bug bites, if the Symbolist bug bites, or from any angle of this, the ancient tradition, then you have to start somewhere. I knew I was born into a lunatic asylum at a very early age, but I didn't know where to. I didn't know how to look to get out of it until well into my 20s, which is still not very old, but I've been at this for a long time. But once the bug bites, and then you start looking into the bibliographies, because this has become, on the backs of, I didn't invent it myself, either. I'm mostly, I see myself as mostly as Schwaller's Boswell in a sense. But my own sources are Schwaller, of course, and before Schwaller, actually, amazing man, G.I. Gurdjieff, which is spelled Gurdjieff. Without Gurdjieff, I would never have done any of this work, actually. He was the only person I've ever met posthumously. He died in 1949, who was as contemptuous as Western civilization as I was, and as I am, with this difference that he knew how to live within it with some degree of equanimity, and I didn't, and I've acquired a bit of that now. But once the bug bites, then you start following your own nose, your own interests, and there's now starting from not just, there's no such thing as biblical. There's virtually no such thing, nothing new under the sun. But my own sources, as I said, are Gurdjieff and Schwaller, to a certain extent. Jung, Carl Jung, there's a whole bunch of people. Very important book in the 60s called Hamlet's Mill by two MIT historians of science, Giorgio de Santillana and Hertha von Deckend. And so they're the forerunners, but now largely in part, I would say, through my own efforts and those of my colleagues, geologist Robert Schock, Michael Schneider, geometrician and mathematician, Graham Hancock, who's traveling around the world, sort of following the links of the ancient tradition, and a very, very, very good journalist. So it's interesting. It's fun reading Hancock. Some of the others are not that gifted, you might say, as writers, but the work that they do. Laird Scranton, who's putting together, demonstrating, very important, Laird Scranton, you should get him on. We'll talk to Jessica. Laird is demonstrating that an advanced cosmology prevailed over much of the planet from as far back as you can get. and this is, again, another big subject, but if people get interested, Google up Laird Scranton, like the Pennsylvania town, Laird Scranton, and he's
Oh,
got
yes.
five or six books out there now proving, to my mind, with a compelling argument that this very advanced cosmology that actually corresponds to much of the latest in quantum physics and torsion and string theory and all of these things. This was around from the very, very beginning, but it was expressed in myth and symbol rather than in mathematics that only mathematicians can understand. And the difference is that most, not all, but most of the cosmologists of today firmly insist, actually, that thinking starts with the mind, that consciousness is a product of the mind. The ancient cosmologies actually start with the premise that consciousness precedes manifestation. And this prevails in Christianity and Buddhism and virtually everywhere, and in the traditional tribes of people that we do not consider. We tend to think of them as primitive because they're non-intellectualized, and sometimes.
And in fact, they're quite advanced. I mean, the way that the way that they live in with the earth, the way that they just this whole notion of consciousness. It's like there's this whole debate about life after death and how science has tried to get in there and say, well, that's just the brain hallucinating after you've gone, but there's, it's the consciousness that's there before and after, and
that's
very
right.
interesting.
And actually, if you follow this stuff, it's coming thick and fast now that science, that even hardcore science magazines like the New Scientist and what's the one here in America? Name escapes me. American something. What the devil is it? But anyway, the absolutely sort of guardians of the paradigm, as it were, are being forced to recognize that there is something to these ideas. And there was a book recently on reincarnation that got a lot of mainstream press. So these ideas are coming at us now thick and fast, and some of them from even being talked about in places that they wouldn't, they just sneered them. They would have either ignored them or derided them 20 years ago, and all of a sudden they're getting quasi-respectable. Well, these are good signs. If enough, as I said, if enough people can get interested in, and in a practical sense, the notion that progress is not civilization, but rather it's, for the most part, it's antithesis, we're not lost. We're not yet doomed. We may still figure out, maybe, a way through this nightmare.
Yes, I mean, it would be great if enough people would go from their own experience rather than just accepting what they're told. If they could
that's right.
question, go inside and question. Go to Egypt, go to the temple, see what you feel. Go inside, go within, question what you really already know to be true, rather than just accepting, well, I read what's in the Bible and that's what I believe,
Yeah, well, these are all big and complex questions, but basically that is the only solution. It's not going to come from artificial intelligence, or in fact, it's not even going to come from intelligence at all. It has to come from an emotional center, and let's say a psycho-spiritual center. If it doesn't come from there, it's just head knowledge, and that gets us nowhere.
Mm-hmm. Well, gosh, this has just been great. We're coming up to the end of our time, and I just want to make sure that people know how they can connect with you to book a space on a trip, or any other thing that you're working on that you want people to be aware of.
Sure. Well, my website, jawest.net or .com, and emails. It's tough to answer all the emails because a lot of them come in. So, if people have specific questions, I do my best to answer, but sometimes it's impossible, and sometimes the questions are complicated, and I just don't have the time to address them. But I do try to address questions, and of course, the trips are the trips, and I intend to continue doing them as long as I can physically get up to 12 or 14 stories of climb that on the inside to climb up to the King's Chamber in the Great Pyramid. As long as I can do that, I reckon I'll be doing trips. So, so far so good.
That's great. Gosh, I just thank you so much for being present with us. It's been such an honor to have you, John.